The young man with the AirPods leaned over to his friend and said, loud enough for the entire VA waiting room to hear, "Bro, look at this guy. The cane is a fashion accessory at this point. You think he actually saw combat? Or did he just type up reports somewhere safe?" his friend snickered. The old veteran in the third chair didn't move. He didn't turn his head. He didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead at a black and white photograph hanging on the far wall. A photograph of 9 young men standing in front of a transport plane 53 years ago, 6 of whom never made it home. The young man, emboldened by silence, kept going. He said something about boomers playing soldier. He said something about how the only thing that Kane had ever fought was a flight of stairs. The young mother across the room pulled her toddler closer and stared at the floor. An older black gentleman 2 rows back clenched his jaw so hard a vein stood out on his neck. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever does. If you believe a quiet veteran deserves more respect than a loud stranger's mouth, type the word honour in the comments right now. Because what happened in that waiting room 10 minutes later is going to stay with you for a very long time. This is the story of Frank Holloway, the cane he carried, and the 8 strides that changed everything for everyone who saw it. Frank was 78 years old that Tuesday morning in October. He had driven himself to the VA hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, the same way he had driven himself everywhere for the last 46 years, alone, slowly, and without complaint. His wife Eleanor had passed in 2019. His son lived in Oregon and called every other Sunday and meant to call more often. Frank lived in a small ranch house at the edge of a hayfield, and he kept the gutters clean and the grass cut and the porch light on for nobody in particular. He was a quiet man. He had always been a quiet man. People in town knew him as the fellow who fixed lawnmowers in his garage for $10 a job and who waved with 2 fingers off the steering wheel when you passed him on Route 19. They knew he had served in Vietnam. They did not know what he had done there. Frank had never told them. Frank had never told anyone. There was a folded green beret in a cedar box at the back of his closet, and there were 3 medals wrapped in tissue paper in a drawer beneath his folded undershirts, and there was a name carved into a black granite wall in Washington, D.C. that Frank visited every November without fail. The name of a man who had carried him 3 miles through enemy jungle on a shattered leg in 1971. Frank did not talk about any of it. He had taken an oath a long time ago, and he had kept it for 54 years and counting. The reason he was at the VA that morning was simple and unremarkable. His knee was failing again. The shrapnel they had pulled out of it in a field hospital outside Saigon in 1972 had left a constellation of scar tissue, and now, half a century later, the joint was finally giving up. Dr. Patel had told him a month ago that they would need to schedule a full replacement, and the surgical consult was today. Frank had parked at the far end of the lot because he didn't believe in taking handicapped spaces when there was somebody with worse legs who might need them. He had signed in at the front desk with hands that trembled only slightly. He had taken the first empty chair he saw, set his cane carefully across his knees, and folded his coffee-stained patient file in his lap. On the lapel of his old olive-drab field jacket, folded over the cane like a small flag, was a tiny embroidered insignia, a winged dagger inside a circle, faded almost to invisibility from decades of washing. Most people would not have known what it meant. Most people had never been told it existed. The men who were told had mostly been told under conditions that prevented them from ever speaking of it again. The young man's name was Tyler. He was 28 years old. He worked in software sales somewhere downtown, and he was at the VA that morning to drop off paperwork for his uncle, a Gulf War veteran who had asked him to run the errand because Tyler had the day off and a working car. Tyler did not want to be there. He thought the building smelled like a nursing home. He had been scrolling on his phone for 15 minutes when he noticed Frank shuffle in, and something about the slowness of it, the cane, the worn jacket, struck him as funny. He elbowed his friend Marcus, who had ridden along to grab lunch afterward, and made the first joke. The first joke got a laugh. The second joke got a bigger laugh. By the third joke, Tyler was performing for the room, and the performance had a momentum he couldn't seem to stop. He didn't notice that the older black gentleman in the back row was now gripping the armrests of his chair hard enough to whiten his knuckles. He didn't notice that the receptionist behind the glass had stopped typing and was watching him with an expression that, if he had been less full of himself, would have frozen the words in his throat. He didn't notice that the old man with the cane had not, in nearly 8 full minutes of mockery, moved a single muscle in his face. What Tyler did not understand What almost nobody in that room understood, including the receptionist who had checked Frank 100 times over the years, was that men like Frank Holloway are trained to do exactly nothing in moments like this. Frank had spent 6 tours running cross-border reconnaissance with a unit whose name appeared on no public document until the year 2000, and even then only partially, and even then only because a Senate subcommittee had finally pried open a file cabinet that had been welded shut for 30 years. He had crossed lines on maps that did not officially exist. He had sat motionless in elephant grass for 37 hours one time, 2 feet from a North Vietnamese supply trail, and he had not so much as twitched a finger when an enemy patrol stopped to light cigarettes within arm's length of his rifle. A loud kid in a waiting room with a phone in his hand was, by every measure of Frank's long and difficult life, beneath the threshold of reaction. So Frank just looked at the photograph on the wall. He looked at the face of Sergeant Ernie Vasquez, second from the left, who had been 23 when the photograph was taken and 23 forever after. He thought about the smell of monsoon rain on canvas and the weight of a friend's hand going still in his own. He waited for his name to be called. It was at that exact moment that the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor swung open with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Dr. Marcus Chen stepped through them holding a manila folder. Dr. Chen was 60 years old. He was the chief of surgery for the Asheville Fiver Medical Center, board certified in orthopedics, with a fellowship in trauma reconstruction and 28 years of operating room hours that had earned him a quiet reputation as the calmest man in any crisis in 3 states. He had a slight stoop from 30 years of operating tables and a small jade pendant that he wore beneath his scrubs in memory of his mother. Before he had become a surgeon, before he had finished medical school, before he had even applied to medical school, Marcus Chen had been a 19-year-old combat medic with the 101st Airborne, and he had spent the worst 6 months of his life in a place called the A Shau Valley in 1972. He had seen things there that he never spoke of, not to his wife, not to his children, not to his colleagues. He had also been saved on a dust-off helicopter in May of that year by a small team of operators who had appeared out of the jungle carrying him and 3 other wounded men. Operators with a winged dagger insignia on their shoulder patches and no names stitched on their uniforms. Marcus Chen had never forgotten that insignia. Marcus Chen had spent 54 years not forgetting that insignia. He glanced at the chart in his hands. He glanced up. He saw the old man with the cane. He saw the worn jacket folded over it. He saw the tiny faded patch on the lapel, the winged dagger inside the circle, the same patch that had bent over him on the floor of a Huey, while a kid medic bled out from a chest wound that everyone in that helicopter, including the kid himself, expected to kill him. And Dr. Marcus Chen, chief of surgery, holder of 2 boards and a research fellowship, and a quiet reputation as the steadiest hands in the building, stopped dead in the middle of the hallway. He set the chart down on the counter without looking at it. He stood very still for a moment, the way a person stands when something they thought they had buried turns out to be alive and breathing across the room. Then he walked. 8 long strides, straight across the waiting room, past the receptionist, past the young mother with the toddler, past Tyler and his friend who had finally noticed that something was happening and had gone quiet mid-laugh. Dr. Chen stopped 3 feet in front of Frank Holloway's chair. He came to attention, and then, in front of every patient and every staff member in that VA waiting room, the chief of surgery snapped his right hand to the brim of an invisible cap and held a salute that was 60 years overdue. "Sergeant First Class Holloway," Dr. Chen said. His voice cracked on the second word and he did not try to hide it. He did not lower his hand. "I don't know if you remember me, sir. May 14th, 1972, the A Shau. There was a kid medic on the floor of a Huey with a sucking chest wound and about 3 minutes left in him. You and 3 other men carried him out of the tree line under fire. You handed him up to the door gunner. You said, and I have remembered every word of this for 54 years, sir. You said, 'Tell him to live.' Then you went back into the trees." Frank's eyes had moved finally away from the photograph on the wall. He was looking up at Dr. Chen now, and his hands, which had been perfectly steady all morning, were trembling on the handle of the cane. "I was the kid, sir," Dr. Chen said. "I'm the kid. I lived." Frank Holloway, who had not cried in front of another human being since his wife's funeral 7 years ago, did not cry now. But his jaw worked once, and he nodded, and he raised his right hand from the cane in a slow, careful, deliberate return salute, and the entire waiting room saw it. The entire waiting room understood in that single instant exactly what they had been watching for the last 20 minutes, and exactly what they had failed to see. The older black gentleman in the back row stood up first. He was a retired Marine Master Sergeant, 3 tours in Iraq, and he came to attention without a word and held it. The young mother put her hand over her mouth and pulled her toddler against her chest. A second older man, sitting near the magazine rack with a VFW cap balanced on his knee, also stood, and he was crying openly because he had seen the same patch on a friend's flag-draped coffin in 1969, and he knew exactly what kind of man wore it, and exactly what kind of war that man had fought and never been allowed to come home and explain. Dr. Chen finally lowered his salute. He turned slowly, deliberately, and he looked across the waiting room at Tyler. He did not say anything cruel. He did not have to. Tyler had gone the colour of typing paper. His phone was face down in his lap. His friend had slid so far down in his chair, he was practically on the floor, trying to disappear into the upholstery. Dr. Chen held Tyler's eyes for one long, quiet, surgical second. Then he turned back to Frank. "Sergeant Holloway," he said quietly, "we're going to fix that knee. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to do it next week, and the hospital's going to clear my schedule for it, because I've been waiting 54 years for the chance to put my hands on the man who put his hands on me. If you'll permit me, sir, I'd be honoured." Frank smiled, just barely, the way old men smile when something inside them that has been wound very tight for a very long time finally lets go a little. "Son," he said, and it was the first thing he had said in the waiting room all morning. "The honour is mine. It always was." Tyler did not finish dropping off his uncle's paperwork that day. He stood up while Dr. Chen was helping Frank into a wheelchair, and he walked across the waiting room on legs that didn't feel like his own, and he stopped in front of the old veteran, and he said, "Sir, I am so sorry. I am so deeply, deeply sorry. I didn't know. I had no right. I had no right even if I had known." Frank looked up at him for a long moment from the wheelchair. He could have said many things. He could have said that knowing wasn't the point, that respect for an old man with a cane shouldn't require knowing what he'd done 60 years ago, in a country most people couldn't find on a map. He could have said that the men he had served with, the 6 in that photograph who never came home, had died for kids exactly like Tyler to have the freedom to be ignorant in public. He didn't say any of that. What he said, in a voice as steady and gentle as a river water over stone, was, "Then learn from it, son. That's all any of us ever asked." Tyler nodded. He could not speak. He went home that afternoon and sat on his couch for 2 hours without turning on the television. And the next morning he called his uncle and asked him, for the first time in his entire life, what the war had been like. His uncle was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then his uncle started crying. They talked for 3 hours. It was the beginning of something Tyler did not yet have a name for, but which he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to live up to. Dr. Marcus Chen performed Frank Holloway's knee replacement 9 days later. The operation went perfectly. Frank walked out of that hospital 10 days after that, slowly but on his own 2 feet, on a new joint, and on his way through the lobby he found that a small group of staff members, surgeons, nurses, orderlies, the receptionist who had checked him in 100 times without ever knowing his name was on a wall in Washington, were standing in 2 quiet rows by the door. Nobody had organised it. They had just heard. They didn't applaud. They didn't need to. They just stood, and they nodded, the way you nod to somebody whose name you have only just learned but should have known all along. Frank touched 2 fingers to his forehead in that old 2-finger wave, and he walked out into the autumn light. The lesson, if there is one in this story, is the oldest lesson there is, and we keep having to learn it because we keep forgetting it. The quietest man in the room is very often the one who has earned the right to shout the loudest and chooses not to. The cane is not a fashion accessory. The worn jacket is not a costume. The old man in the 3rd chair sitting silently while a stranger mocks him is not a joke and never was. He is more often than you will ever know the exact reason you get to sit there safely and be ignorant of him. So the next time you see a slow old man with a cane shuffling into a waiting room, hold the door, give him your seat, lower your voice. You will almost never know what he did. You will almost never know what it cost him. You do not need to. If this story moved you, if you believed that every veteran, loud or quiet, decorated or invisible, the ones who came home with parades and the ones who came home in silence, deserves to be seen and respected, subscribe to this channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and leave one word in the comments below for Sergeant First Class Frank Holloway and every man like him. Honor. Because they earned every letter of it, and they are still earning it every quiet morning, in every waiting room, in every small town in America, whether we see them or not.